October 3rd, 1993, an elite military unit launched a bold daylight raid in the center of Mogadishu, Somalia. Their aim was to capture 2 lieutenants of warlord Mohammed Farah Aidid, a mission that should have taken 1 hour turned into the largest firefight involving American troops since Vietnam. By the end of the next day, 18 U.S. soldiers, an estimated 500 Somalis, were dead. An upcoming CNN documentary looks at the purpose and the outcome of the mission.
I don't know what the other guys were thinking, but I was kind of thinking, wow, you know, we're pretty much invincible.
Up until October 3rd and 4th, every mission we did went exactly the way it was supposed to go.
He walked up to me and he told me he had a really bad feeling about today, meaning October 3rd, and he tried to hand me his little packet to send off to his parents, and I said, no, keep it. I said, you know, I'm going to see you in about half an hour anyway. I said, nothing's going to happen, and that was the last time that I saw him.
I know when our helicopter came in, we immediately started taking fire from the ground.
All of a sudden, they're already shooting at us.
And I was just shooting everything that moved. It didn't matter to me.
Yeah, I just started to yell, I'm hit, I'm hit.
It was one nasty gunfight.
Wow, I've actually killed a person.
His eyes were wide open and his mouth was open like he was screaming, but he had already died. He was already dead.
I felt so alive because I was literally that close to death.
What are we doing here? How have we mucked up so badly? How could this possibly have happened?
Joining me now to discuss the conflict in Somalia, journalist Mark Bowden. In his new book, Black Hawk Down, he has recreated the events using extensive interviews with both U.S. soldiers and Somalis. Also joining the discussion, 2 soldiers who participated in the battle. From Atlanta, former Ranger and machine gunner Sean Nelson. From Salt Lake City, Daniel Schilling, an Air Force combat controller. I am pleased to have both of them. I go first to Sean Nelson in Atlanta. What would you have wanted Mark to capture in this book about this story? Sean?
Exactly what he did, Charlie. I don't think he could have done a better job. I think he hit it right on the head.
What is it do you think he captured for you that hits it right on the head?
It was almost as if Mark is providing a literary snapshot of exactly what happened on that particular day.
If in the future a child comes to you, your own child or family, and says, you know, to you, what happened? What would you say to them? I mean, tell me the significance of what happened in Mogadishu.
It's a difficult thing to explain, Charlie. The best thing I'd be able to do would be to have someone actually read Mark's account of the battle first, and then as best I could answer any questions that a family member or a child would field me.
Okay. We'll come back and talk about the personal experiences you had. How'd you come to do this?
Well, I was just struck by it as a great story. There are some stories as a writer that you just stumble upon and do your best to stay out of the way of, and that's what this was. I consider it to be both a very dramatic story and a really important incident.
What made it a great story?
Well, what made it a great story to me initially, what attracted me was the notion of 99 soldiers pinned down and surrounded in this ancient African city fighting for their lives. It just conjured up images to me of classic military confrontations like the Little Bighorn or the Alamo.
Yeah, that's the first thing I thought, Alamo. I said, this is a story of people looking at the inevitability of death.
Right.
And thinking of comrades and thinking of and not thinking of courage, but acting with courage.
Right. And what does that experience do to somebody? You know, I grew up listening to the stories that my uncles and my father told about World War II, And of course, we all were exposed to all the movies and television which dealt with war subject matter when we were younger. Too young myself to have fought in the war in Vietnam. But as a writer, I long felt that, that combat would afford just the richest, most dramatic material for a writer if you could get inside the heads of the soldiers who were fighting it, and ideally on both sides.
Because it has life and death, it has fear and courage, it has all those elements that are at the highest level of human emotion.
That's right. And Leo Tolstoy wrote that he was far more interested in what was going on in an individual soldier's mind or heart in a battle than he was in the historical analysis of the strategies involved, or why one side won or why the other side
The bigger
won.
picture.
Right. The more human picture.
I mean, he wanted to do the more human rather than the big picture.
Yeah.
Tell me as succinctly as you can how this came to happen.
The battle or the book?
The battle first.
The battle came to happen because after the United States had successfully sent 20,000 Marines to Somalia to end a famine, there was concern, and I think understandable concern, that if they just withdrew that force, that the various feuding clans would go back to fighting again, and that the situation would the famine would start up. So they began trying to create a coalition government among these feuding clan leaders. And the idea of sharing power was obviously one that appealed to all of the lesser warlords. It didn't appeal to Mohammed Farah Aidid because he was the most powerful of them and felt that if everyone just left everything alone, he would prevail in the long run. So he waited until the Marines were withdrawn in the spring of 1993, and they were replaced by a relatively weaker force of Pakistani troops, and he began attacking then the U.S. peacekeepers. In June, he slaughtered 24 Pakistani soldiers. The person who was in charge of running the UN operation was a retired American admiral named Jonathan Howe. And Howe obviously felt that it was unconscionable that this two-bit warlord was thwarting the will of the UN in Mogadishu by killing peacekeeping soldiers. So he prevailed on Washington to send this elite unit called Task Force Ranger, made up primarily of Rangers and Delta Force, to arrest Aidid and round up all of his key leaders and effectively remove him as a military player from the equation in Mogadishu. The battle happened because on this particular day, they roped into a neighborhood to grab two of his lieutenants, expecting to maybe be on the ground for about 30 minutes, and the Somalis managed to shoot down a Black Hawk helicopter, hence the title of my book, Black Hawk Down, which is the reason why all those soldiers had to stay.
Because they don't leave their comrades there.
That's right.
Whether they're dead or alive.
Exactly. And so they all acted on that impulse. In fact, Sean was one of the first Rangers on the ground when he saw that helicopter go down, who instinctively began to move, even though it was a very dangerous thing to do, to the site of the downed Black Hawk in order to try and save and protect the crew.
Remember that time for us, Sean, if you will.
Well, Charlie, as Mark just covered, the meat of the mission, so to speak, was just about over. And again, like Mark has already said, the mission was only going to take about 30, 45 minutes, and we were actually in the process of wrapping up the mission, and the aircraft that were going to pull us out of that mission and take us back to the hangar where we were staying were coming in to get us. And as the lead helicopter came in to the landing zone, I was a machine gunner in the perimeter, and I was closest to it, and I actually saw the helicopter get shot, which was something at that point in time I couldn't believe. And I actually saw it crash, and it happened probably 50 to 75 yards from where I was standing. At that point in time, when I witnessed that event take place, it was almost as if I was in complete shock. For perhaps a second or two, I was completely paralyzed with fear and realized right then that things as I knew it had completely changed. And like Mark has already stated, I knew that more than anything, myself and the folks on the ground had to get to the people in that helicopter, whether it be the pilot, the crew chief, and I believe there may have been a few members from Delta in that helicopter at that point in time. And I actually like Mark said, broke and decided to head on to the crash site myself. And also at that point in time, the lieutenant who was providing guidance and leadership for us was basically giving me orders not to head that way. And I just used my own self-judgment and decided, well, these guys aren't going to live much longer if we don't get down there. And so I kind of took responsibility in my own hands and started heading that way to see what I could do myself.
Were you at that time saying, oh my God, this is not going to be pretty and we're not going to get out of here?
Yeah, you're exactly right. At that point in time, I realized, well, if we can clean this up and get these guys out of here and get them back to us, everything could still be okay. But then that, from the second that helicopter got shot down, things started to break down very rapidly. I think there were 2 other helicopters that got hit within about a span of several minutes right after that. Another one crashed, and I think another one was able to limp back to the site that it had taken off from.
Let me come back to Mark, and then I want to go out to Dan in Salt Lake City. How did this come to be that they shot down these helicopters?
Well, partly it was because of humanitarian reasons. The rules of engagement that these soldiers had when they went out into this mission were they were only allowed to shoot at Somalis who were armed and posing an immediate threat to the soldiers on the ground. Now, these Black Hawks have miniguns and rockets, and they can fly high over a battle, well out of range of anything that the Somalis could have shot at them. But because they were trying to pick out appropriate targets, they had snipers in the back of the Black Hawks, and they were flying in a very low orbit over the target area, picking out individuals who it was okay for them to shoot at. And it was because of that they were flying that low, and also because the force got delayed slightly on the ground, that the Somalis were able to shoot up enough rocket-propelled grenades into the air that eventually the air was thick with them, and they hit one of the Black Hawks.
Where were you, Dan?
I was with the convoy, Charlie, at the Target building where we were policing up the rest of the people, and then I moved with the convoy from there in the hopes of picking up the down helicopter crew and the search and rescue folks that had gone in there, and then we would all go back together.
Was there, today for you, Dan, is there a moment that sears in your soul and brain more than any other? A time?
Well, there wasn't anything that really leapt right out and grabbed me. It kind of creeped up on me as things started to come apart. And like many military battles, a big problem was communication, and communication tends to break down when the situation gets dire. And so for me, what I really remember was this creeping feeling as we started to drive around the city, which we did for quite a while, in an attempt to pick these guys up. I just had this overwhelming feeling that we were just going to continue to drive around the city until we were all dead, because we were taking incredible numbers of casualties, it seemed at the time, on the convoy.
What was the most heroic thing you saw that day?
God, I couldn't even, there are so many things that men did on behalf of other men that were selfless beyond anything that you could ever describe. One of the things that I find amazing was when the helicopter crew that was inserting the search and rescue guys at this helicopter crash site, the first one that Sean was just describing, he got hit by an RPG also, right in the tail boom, and I've seen the footage. And these guys were sliding down ropes out of the back of this helicopter at that time, and when he got hit by this RPG and the whole helicopter shudders, his instinct is to pick up and actually pull pitch, is what they call it, and fly out of there. But of course he couldn't. He had to remain calm and stay on the scene until those guys got to the ground safely, and then and only then could he actually leave the area. That was an incredible thing. I saw guys who were shot help pull other guys out of the way, even though they were just as badly injured. The list goes on. I would fail you if I attempted to describe a single event that I thought was more incredible than anything else.
Tell me the story about Tim Wilkinson.
Oh, Tim Wilkinson was, like Dan Schilling, an Air Force special operations soldier. He was what they call a pararescueman or a parajumper. And he was one of the guys on the ropes that Dan was just describing when that helicopter was hit. He hit the ground, and his job was to rescue the crew and the pilots, anyone who was injured. He's a very, very highly trained, skillful medic. He did that. He helped search the bird, dragged out the men, got out the body of the co-pilot. And once he set up sort of a combat casualty point around that first down Black Hawk, he was told that across this wide street, which now was just filled with bullets, was a young ranger named Carlos Rodriguez who had been shot very critically in the hip and possibly had a femoral artery hit and was in danger of bleeding to death. So Tim gathered up his medical kit and sprinted across this roadway, much to the amazement of everyone, got there, gave some emergency first aid to this young ranger and realized he needed more fluids to keep this guy alive. So initially he called for the men across the street to throw these bags toward him. And then after he asked them to do that, he began to wonder, well, you know, maybe they'll get hit with bullets. You know, they could break open when they hit the ground. This is not a good idea. If they land in the middle of the street, I'm going to have to run out and get them and come back. So he just decided, what the hell? And he ran across the road a second time to fetch this stuff, and then a third time came across in order to be able to save this young ranger's life. So it's just one, as Dan pointed out, of
one heroic
many
after another.
amazing acts.
2 Medal of Honors?
Yes, the 2 Medal of Honors went to Randy Shugart and Gary Gordon, 2 Delta operators who, when the second Black Hawk crashed, there was no rescue team to come to their aid. So these 2 men volunteered to go down on the ground by themselves to hold off a mob of hundreds and growing to be thousands of armed Somalis in an effort to sort of stave off disaster until some rescue force could reach that chopper on the ground.
When you look at it now, what was the most important lesson coming out of this?
Well, there are a lot of lessons on many levels. To me, the most important lesson is that war is war. And after the Persian Gulf experience, which we witnessed on television from a great distance, I think that a lot of Americans, including our leadership in the White House, had a fairly naive perception that we have such a powerful and technologically superior military that we can work our will in these small places around the world without our guys getting hurt. And I think the primary lesson of Black Hawk Down is that when bullets start to fly, Americans still bleed, just the way everybody else does. And the calculation that needs to be made before you make a commitment or send our soldiers into a mission like this is what sort of casualties are we likely to see, and is it worth it? And that's a decision that needs to be made up front. I think that the American people need to be prepared for that decision. Congress needs to be prepared for it. The President needs to be prepared for it, because if you cut and run, which is what we did the day after this battle, you render all that heroism and sacrifice meaningless.
Do you guys feel like that heroism and sacrifice was rendered meaningless?
I don't, actually. In a sense, it's true from a political viewpoint, because, in fact, we didn't complete the mission we were sent there to do. We would have, had we stayed much longer. I suspect within a couple of weeks we would have had a deed. But when it comes down to fighting, and Mark has just pointed that out, you know, this is about men fighting in combat. And you have to set those political agendas aside, because this was a battle of survival in the final analysis. With everything that happened, the guys were out there fighting for their lives, and we were in desperate situations. And the highest thing you can do as a human is to risk your life, and possibly even lose your life, to save this other man, which is what makes this book such a great book. There are a lot of children who don't have fathers now. 15 children lost fathers on that day. And they should understand what their fathers did. My father may have lost his life saving this man's life, and that made all the difference. And it's so important for the families to have access to that information, which they very rarely do in special operations. This book is really an exception to that.
It reminds me once of Senator Bob Kerrey, who won the Medal of Honor in Vietnam, said to me, and the reason, there were a lot of people who did what I did. It just so happened that somebody saw what I did and wrote about it.
Right.
You know,
events have no power unless they're remembered.
Yeah.
And I think that's why it's so important, both for the individual soldiers and for society, to note and remember when we do send soldiers into situations like this.
Sean, go ahead.
And Charlie, I would just like to throw in 2 points. One, that I do agree with Mark that this has had a dramatic change on how the U.S. military, or actually the U.S. government, is implementing their foreign policy with the military currently. And that two, and I'm just saying this as a soldier offering feedback to politicians, if you are going to commit the troops, please allow the troops to follow through on your commitment. That's really all I have on that.
What do you have on what you learned about yourself because of this experience?
What I learned about myself?
Yeah.
Wow. I'm still actually, to this day, piecing that together. It does, an event of that magnitude does completely change your life. For the majority, it's a positive change, and there is a minority of some negative change. The fact that I have to live on without some of the best friends that I've ever made.
Doesn't get any harder than that. Sean Nelson from Atlanta, Army Ranger. Dan Schilling, Army Ranger from Salt Lake City, Air Force.
That's right, Dan's an Air Force
Dan's
guy.
an Air Force guy. This book by Mark Bowden is called Black Hawk Down, A Story of Modern War. It is a story of heroism and character and death, and a story of comradeship, and a story of responsibility and duty, and the exercise of care for your colleagues. Thank you very much, Mark.
Thank you, Charlie.
Extraordinary. As we leave you, there is this footage coming from a CNN documentary, Black Hawk Down, A Story of Modern War. It airs on April 11th at 8 p.m., and my thanks to CNN, and we leave you with footage from their documentary.
The target is a three-story building in the heart of Aidid's neighborhood, across from the Olympic Hotel. Several of Aidid's top lieutenants are supposedly inside. 3:42 in the afternoon, Delta commandos who have choppered in take positions along the outside wall as someone from inside the target building steps out onto the roof to see what's going on. Moments later, the Blackhawks pass overhead, preparing to offload the Rangers.
As we were sliding down the road, so we could hear bullets snapping by, and I kind of thought then that was kind of weird, because before, for the other missions, we had been shot at, but it took a while for that to start up once the Somalis realized, oh yeah, they're over there.